This is Mr. Dietrich. The latest videos have triggered some people, offended some people, and I do apologize. But let's talk about why you might be offended by a video talking about minimum wage or the ideas of an American thinker. And then let's also go back into minimum wage and explain why it's a bad idea. Now, the triggered may say the argument was a straw man. Well, the argument was pretty simple that if you believe that raising the minimum wage lifts people out of poverty in America, then why not just do the same in Ethiopia rather than send over billions and billions of dollars? Just ask him to raise the minimum wage, of which you probably say it's much more complicated than that. It's not really. We really just need to boil it down to you. Forget about the statistics and economics, macro and micro, and whatever your political leanings are as an economist. Let's talk about you and how you perceive things. So when you think about minimum wage, or more specifically, when you watch the video and you were thinking about what I was discussing, there are plenty of assumptions. When I talk about minimum wage in America, you have the assumption in your brain right now, I'm talking to you, Triggered, that the boss has got enough money to pay more people. The boss is a fat cat. The boss is rich. The boss drives a fast car, big car. He's got plenty of money to spare. He can pay people more, raise the minimum wage. You have that assumption when we talk about it in America. But when we talked about in Ethiopia, you don't have that same set of assumptions. When I simply stated that, well, why don't they just raise the minimum wage in Ethiopia? That'll lift people out of poverty. You can't do that. They can't afford to do that. Why can't they afford to do that? Why do you automatically assume that they can't afford to do that? And in America, you do assume that they can do that. Why is that already some a priori assumption built into your brain, a foundational concept or belief? You immediately can switch back and forth between, well, they can't afford it and we can't afford it. I mean, how do you know that a single mother running a coffee shop, working 20 hours a day, raising a family on her own, she can pay her employees more? The guy running the hamburger stand who is working 20 hours a day, a guy running a restaurant on his own, he can easily just pay his people more in America. You just assume that the bosses in America, all bosses in America, can easily pay people more, yet you don't have that same set of assumptions when we talk about Ethiopia. Why is that? You assume that, well, they can't afford to pay people more, so raising the minimum wage in Ethiopia is not going to fix things. But here we all can. So again, yeah, this is a little bit about you today. And we're also going to hammer in the idea. Now, again, talking about you, let's talk about me. So we are talking about you and your perception of minimum wage. And there is plenty of economists that will go through the numbers and point out that, well, actually, when you raise the minimum wages, prices don't increase. And so it's good. People are getting paid more, prices don't increase. You're missing the target. That's not the point. Again, we're talking about you. You've missed it. You missed the target. You missed the boat. We're not talking about prices. We're talking about employees. We're talking about getting hired. We're talking about getting fired. Who's working? How does the minimum wage and raising it affect employment practices, mainly hiring and firing? Well, let's break it down, folks. The boss has got, according to his expenses, that fat cat that you hate and despise because he's got the red, white, and blue on, he's got $20 that he can afford to pay towards his employees every hour. That's it. When he goes through his expenses and pays for buying his cheeseburgers and paying for all the things that he has to do with the store and his overhead, he does have $20 as part of his funds to pay employees. Okay, that's in this imaginary situation. And in this situation, this scenario, we've got 2 employees, so he can divide that up and he can hire 2 workers. He's got $20, so he can hire 2 workers rather than do all the work himself. So he's working, he's frying the fries, cooking the burgers, and he's also now got 2 people. So one person's up front doing some work, hopefully, and then another person in the back helping him cook and also clean. We got a pretty good show. I mean, it's a typical small mom and pop restaurant. A couple people working their butts off, doing a lot of different jobs, but you got just enough people to get enough done, working on a very tight budget. Well, then all of a sudden, big old government comes along and says, sorry, you got to pay people $20 an hour because we need people to be able to afford how to live in this country. And so the boss says, well, guess what? I still only have $20. You didn't give me any money. I didn't make any more money. My expenses, my overhead, it's all still the same. But now, by rule, I am no longer allowed to pay these employees who willingly accepted this job, who work side by side, hand in hand with me every day, $10 an hour. I'm now forced by big government to pay one of them 20, and I'm forced to let one go. Oh, nuts. Now, instead of having three hands on deck, it's just the boss and another guy running back and forth, trying to do the best they can to serve their customers, to serve their community, to generate a profit, to keep this business going, to feed the people. The boss is working more now. The singular employee is working more now. And heck, that one guy doesn't even have a job now. What about him? How's he going to take care of his kids? I got to feed my kids. Or even if it's just a teenager, that's even a worse situation. Well, it's probably not a worse situation, but it's bad because teenagers gain entry-level experience. Often these low-paying jobs are just their first job. It goes on a resume that leads to a second higher-paying job, a third higher-paying job, and then positions up the ladder. But if you can't get one step on the ladder, you never get on that ladder, and you stay on the ground. And what keeps you on the ground? A minimum wage law that requires a boss to only pay one of their employees now. Never gets the experience, never gets a job, unemployed for life. Now, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but at the very least, it slows this person's down in the growth, in the race of life, to get ahead, to build that resume, to build experience, to build skills. And you're slowing the economy down. You are hurting people. Prices don't rise. Great. Congratulations. You just don't get it. Again, we're talking about you and the way that you perceive things and what you've been told. Shake it off. Forget what they have told you. Think about things from all angles, from all perspectives. Are you becoming less triggered or more triggered? Am I triggering you more? If I am triggering you more, again, the problem was never the Ethiopian thought experiment. The problem was never looking at statistics or data or debating analytics. The problem is your unwillingness to objectively look at all different views. Hey, it's good the prices don't rise. I'm willing to accept that. And I think that can be the case in many scenarios. And it can work out very well for some people. But we also have to admit that it doesn't work out for some people. And we have to make the decision of, do we want big government coming in, making these laws and forcing bosses to make these decisions, putting restrictions on certain people? You get to decide. You want to ignore things? Up to you. But ultimately, this shrinks the economy. When you take a worker out of the economy, that takes away his growth, that takes away his productivity. Not only is he not producing, and I doubt that this business is producing as much as they were before when it's only 2 employees, whereas before it was 3 employees. So we're losing sales, we're losing production. He's losing skills, he's losing talent, or she, and not developing. Those could be future gains, strong, big, beneficial gains to our economy when we take people out of the workforce. More people in the workforce, more growth, more GDP, and in the long run, our economy becomes strong. It does not become stronger with artificially mandated price mandates. Now let's go back to square one then. Let's not talk about someone getting fired. Let's talk about at the beginning. Let's say the minimum wage law has been passed. You got to pay some people $20 an hour. Well, who's going to get that job when I can only select one rather than 2? It's going to come down to the resume. And in most cases, when we're talking about teenagers, we're looking at the grade cards. Who's going to have the better grade card? Well, let's say it's this person has the better grade card. And typically the person who has a better grade card who's done better in school is typically more privileged. I know they're triggered. People love talking about privilege and the unfairness of society and oppression. Well, guess what? Minimum wage takes your beloved oppression, your intersectionality, your us versus them Marxism, and just exacerbates it. Because when we pass this minimum wage law and we can only hire one, we're going to hire the person with the better resume, the better grade card, which early in life tends to favor those that are privileged, those who grew up in better homes, in better environments, in better situations. And so they have a better grade card, they get a job. Who doesn't get the job? Who gets held back? Who gets held down? Who gets oppressed? The people that are already getting held down and oppressed. The people that you're always talking about. The society is always holding us back. It's oppressive. It's racist. It's sexist. It's misogynistic. It's the patriarchy. All those things that you hate. Minimum wage just inflates and exacerbates that and makes it worse. People from broken homes. These are the people that have grade cards. Maybe they got B's, but they're not A's, so they don't get the job. And so that's the situation. People that were already getting hurt get hurt more by minimum wage. Thomas Sowell writes about this extensively in many of his books, and we'll talk about that in a second, about how black teenagers in 1948 had the same employment rate as white teenagers. Minimum wage laws come along, and the story shifts. What's the story? Let's go into the story. Let's go into the statistics. You want stats? You complained about stats in the previous video about Ethiopia. Well, this is all just kind of a discussion more than it is actually looking at analytics. So look at the data. 1948, folks. A time that was a little less partisan. So we can trust this economic data. Not only can we trust it for being less partisan, we've had 70 years to review the data. So if the data were wrong, I think somebody would have come along in, I don't know, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, 10s, and said, oh, the data's wrong. Well, the data's right. So who was unemployed? Well, if we looked at the unemployment rate in 1948, black teenagers, white teenagers, same rate. Same rate. We're talking 1948, we're talking Jim Crow, a time where there were de jure segregation. There was de facto segregation. There were laws that created a racist society. But in 1948, black teenagers and white teenagers had the same unemployment rate, meaning they were getting hired at the same rate. Big government comes along, passes minimum wage laws, and we see black teenagers' unemployment rate double. Now, why is that? That's racism. There it is. Well, folks, why did racism suddenly appear after the law and not before the law? If society was racist with the Jim Crow laws, then it should have been double before. Racist bosses would have been hiring white teenagers at a higher rate than black teenagers. But the racism didn't magically appear until all of a sudden we passed the law. They were at the same rate. But then you're going to believe that after the law, that's when the boss wakes up and suddenly becomes a racist. Wakes up from his sleep, puts on, she's like, I'm going to be a racist today. Probably not the case. So then why does the black teenager unemployment rate double after the minimum wage law? Well, it's pretty simple. It goes back down to resume, unfortunately. It goes back down to experience. It goes back down to education and grade cards. And we will and do know that in 1948, schools were segregated before Brown versus the Board of Education. And in many of those cases, those segregated schools did not receive the same resources, funds, teachers, or just general education as the white teenagers, meaning that the white teenagers often had, at an early age in life, more experience in education than black teenagers. And when you raise the minimum wage law and you make the bosses choose between the two, and they have to choose based on something, they're going to choose the person with better education, the better resume. And unfortunately, that ended up being the white teenagers in this case. And so we see the black teenagers double. Now, you can make an argument there was definitely some racism involved, but more than likely, the lack of experience, education, and again, being held back by society, oppressed by society, not quite having the advantages and privileges in society, those were compounded by the minimum wage law. Before the minimum wage law, what the black teenagers could do is accept less pay to get the job to make up for the resume. Again, it's not like bosses weren't looking at resumes before the minimum wage law. It wasn't like they had equal experience before the minimum wage law. I mean, the same segregation of schools existed, the same lack of experience existed, the same weaker resume existed, but the black teenagers had a card up their sleeve. They had a negotiation tactic. They could, if given the opportunity, accept a little less. It's not fair. A little less. Now we see this today with immigrants to our country. Money to get the job. And by getting your foot in the door, they build experience. They go on to be very successful citizens. But when you pass minimum wage law, you take that card away. You take away that negotiation tactic. Black teenagers can no longer negotiate a lower wage just to get the job. And in that case, then having to pay the same rate then requires that you hire the person with the better experience. Let's keep talking about this. Bosses making a choice between A and B. So if the boss has to pick between more experience and less experience, obviously the job is going to go to the guy with more experience. Well, the person with less experience, like I just said in the previous example, can just accept lower wages. And then they can get the job and they can get the opportunity. But when you pass a law, like a minimum wage law, or famously in 1931, the Davis-Bacon Act, that says, nope, there is a minimum you have to pay employees, then the boss is ultimately going to have to choose differently. He's going to pick more experience. Can't pay the purple less anymore. Has to pay them a certain amount, and at that specific amount, he's going to hire the person with more experience. That's the effect of minimum wage law has. That's the effect of the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931, which was specifically designed out of racism. White employees and workers, union workers, did not want to lose jobs to blacks and African Americans migrating north to the cities and taking their jobs. Black Americans, ancestors of slaves, moved north for opportunities to the cities of Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Columbus, Chicago. And they lacked much experience because they were the ancestors of slaves. But they were able to find work and provide for the families by accepting lower wages. By accepting lower wages, bosses were willing to dismiss the lack of experience. White workers got mad, losing their jobs, argued for the Davis-Bacon Act. It was passed. Now bosses could not pay them less. And so the bosses went back to hiring the whites. University of Washington study, just to close us out, looked at the Seattle $15 an hour minimum wage and what were the effects recently of that. Well, you guessed it, low-skilled workers' hours dropped by 9.4%. Again, the boss still only has so much money that he can spend on workers. He doesn't magically have more money once you pass the minimum wage. So he's hiring less workers, and we see the hours of those workers drop. So that means less experience. That also means less production, all of which are bad for the economy. 14 million hours of work or production was lost. That's 14 million hours of growth, 14 hours of economic growth, stimulation, consumer spending, producers producing more and more. As you make more goods, prices of goods goes down. But when you have 14 million hours less, then you make less, and supply goes down, price actually goes up. Not good for the economy. And last, low wages jobs declined by 6.8%. So that's 5,000 jobs, 5,000 opportunities out the window, 5,000 people that would have developed that entry-level skill, which would lead to job number 2 and job number 3. None of that happens. Not good for the economy. There you have it, folks. Got you on the stats today. No one's triggered anymore. We all get it.